My name is Jacob Peterson. I'm 65 years old. And what I'm about to tell you isn't a story about grief. It's a story about war. It started 1 week after I buried my wife of 40 years. My son and his wife called an inheritance meeting. They sat across from me in a boardroom built on my sweat and my wife's soul, and they made their demand. My daughter-in-law, Brenda, smiled a smile colder than a Chicago winter and said, "Now that the old woman is gone, you'll sign the company over to my husband and learn to fend for yourself." I smiled right back. Because she didn't know my lawyer was about to walk in, not with a will, but with a sealed envelope that would unravel a 40-year-old secret and burn her entire world to the ground. If you believe loyalty is earned, not inherited, stay with me. You're going to want to see how this ends. Kenji Ishikawa walked in like ice dropping into whiskey. Brenda's face flickered irritation, then recalculation. This was supposed to be her ambush. "What a surprise," she said. "I wasn't aware this meeting needed legal counsel." "This isn't a family meeting, Brenda," I said flatly. "It's business. Kenji is the company's lawyer. He's always present for important business." My son Ryan shifted in his seat. "Dad, what Brenda meant," she cut him off without looking at him. "What I mean is perfectly clear." Then she turned back to me, the predator's smile gone, replaced by cold pragmatism. "Jake, let's be practical. Carol's gone. The board, the investors, the employees, they need stability. Ryan's been COO for 10 years. It's the next logical step. It's what Carol would have wanted. Her legacy." She dared to use that word to justify her own greed. I looked at my son. "Is that what you think, Ryan? That your mother would want me to hand over everything she and I bled for a week after her funeral?" He couldn't hold my eyes. "I'm just thinking about stability, Dad. People are worried. I thought of Carol and me 40 years ago, spreading bills across the carpet of a rented apartment. Truck grease under my fingernails after 16-hour days." Ryan's hands had never held anything heavier than a 5-iron. "Why the rush, Brenda?" I asked. The question threw her. She'd expected a fight, not logic. "It isn't a rush. It's being decisive," she snapped. "You're distracted." "Distracted," I said. "I was burying my wife. That's not distraction, Brenda. That's being human. Try it sometime." Her mask slipped. "You're tired. Everyone saw you let things slide while Carol was sick. The performance reports don't lie." There it was, her ammunition, gathered for months, waiting for my wife to take her last breath. I stood, palms flat on the table. "I've given my entire life to this company. I was here when it was one truck and a dream. I was here when we nearly went bankrupt in 2008. And I was here holding my wife's hand until her final breath. I'm not going anywhere. I own 51% of the voting shares. I am the board. This meeting is over." Brenda's fury cracked through. "Fine, old man. We'll see how long you last. You're a relic. Relics belong in museums." She stormed out, dragging a silent Ryan behind her. Alone in that room, I felt every one of my 65 years. She was right about one thing: I was tired. She was wrong about everything else. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a war Carol had already prepared me to fight. I didn't go home. The silence in that house would have been too loud. Instead, I met Kenji at a small coffee shop across town. "Start with any vendors hired without my approval," I told him. "New accounts opened in the last 18 months. Let Brenda think I'm too broken to notice anything. While she plans her coronation, build her gallows." He didn't ask why. 20 years, as my lawyer had taught him, that when I gave an order like that, the war had already begun. Sitting there, I remembered something Carol told me a year earlier, watching a sunset from our porch. "It's Brenda," she'd said. "I don't trust her, Jake." She looks at Ryan and doesn't see a husband. She sees a stock option. She looks at this company and doesn't see a legacy. She sees a prize. I dismissed it as a protective mother's worry. She'd been right all along, and I hadn't listened. 4 days later, Kenji called. His voice was stripped of warmth. "Jake, I found something. It's bad. A shell company, B&R Consulting, registered in Delaware. Brenda and Ryan, sole proprietors. For 22 months, it had billed Peterson Freight for vague services, market analysis, logistics reports, each invoice just under the threshold that required my signature. Ryan, as COO, approved everyone alone. The reports never existed. Department heads had never heard of the firm. "How much, Kenji?" A pause. $812,450. While I sat with Carol through chemotherapy, they were writing fake invoices. While I held her hand as she died, they were stealing from her. Where did it go? Wire transfers. A down payment on a ski chalet in Aspen. A brand new Porsche 911 registered to Brenda. They weren't saving. They were living a fantasy funded by lies, laughing at us the whole time. Get me everything, I told him. Every dime, every purchase. I want it all. The 800,000 was ugly, but it felt incomplete, a symptom, not the disease. Carol had been suspicious before the theft got this bad. I needed to understand what she knew, and there was only one person who might tell me, Maria Sanchez, Carol's private nurse. I found her tending roses in her small Pilsen garden. She pulled me into a hug that felt more real than anything I'd received in weeks. Over chamomile tea, she told me Carol had changed in her last 2 months, secretive, making private calls to Kenji, having Maria bring down old ledgers from the attic. She wasn't reminiscing, Maria said. She was investigating. She kept muttering, "It doesn't add up." Then Maria went inside and came back with a small, tarnished key. She made me promise, Maria said. If you ever needed to fight, this would be your shield and your sword. It was a key to a safe deposit box at First National Bank, opened in 1979, before Carol and I were even married. The next morning I stood in the cold silence of the bank vault, pulled out box 31B and lifted the lid. No cash, no jewelry, just old paper. A photo of young Carol, achingly sad. A bundle of letters. And underneath, a birth certificate for Ryan Peterson. Father, Jacob Peterson. Mother, a name from a life I'd buried 45 years ago, not Carol's name. Beneath it, adoption papers, transferring parental rights to Carol Chenoweth 6 months later. And at the bottom, a leather diary in Carol's young, hopeful handwriting. I read it with shaking hands. 9 months before our wedding, a woman from my past had shown up on our doorstep with a baby, my mistake. A night I thought I'd buried and paid to disappear. I'd lied to Carol and told her it was nothing. She hadn't believed me. She'd followed me, watched me hand over cash, and seen the baby, thin, hollow-eyed mother, a child with no hope ahead of him. She confronted me. I broke down and confessed everything. And instead of leaving, which everyone would have understood, she made a choice. She would adopt the child. She would raise him as her own. And I would never, ever tell him the truth. I am building our family on a foundation of forgiveness, she wrote. I will love this child so fiercely that the lie becomes the truth. The diary traced his first steps, his first word, mama, underlined 3 times. Near the end, an entry from 5 years ago after Ryan's wedding. Brenda, there's something calculating about her. She looks at Ryan like a stepping stone. Maybe I made him too soft to see it. I sat in that vault and wept for her strength, for my blindness, for the son I was about to lose all over again. 3 days later, Brenda and Ryan showed up at my door, furious. Their cards declined, accounts frozen. I let Brenda rage, then looked past her straight at Ryan. I'm protecting your mother's legacy, I said. Her entire legacy, the parts you know about and the parts you don't. Are you sure you know what that legacy is, son? The question landed somewhere Brenda's insults never could. I left them standing in the foyer and walked away. The tripwire was set. The next morning I called an emergency board meeting. Brenda would see it as the last gasp of a cornered old man. She had no idea she was walking into an ambush. In the boardroom, Kenji laid 6 binders on the table like nails for a coffin. Brenda opened with a rehearsed speech about my grief, my missed meetings, my lost edge. Ryan sat beside her, a puppet king. The board looked uncomfortable until I nodded to Kenji. He put on his glasses and began. B&R Consulting. Registered agents, Brenda and Ryan Peterson. 22 invoices, all for services no one had ever received. All approved by Ryan alone, each one just under my sign-off threshold. Then the money trail, the wire transfer, the Aspen deed in Brenda's name, the Porsche registration, the credit card payoffs at Neiman Marcus and Cartier, and finally a private savings account. Jointly owned, funded 2 days after our last confrontation. The final slide was just a number, $812,450. Ryan collapsed into a stammering wreck. Brenda tried to spin it as bonuses, then turned on me, calling me vindictive, incompetent. I let her finish. Then I laid the timeline bare, March. While Carol learned she had weeks to live, they billed for market analysis. April, while I held her hand as she told me she was scared, they wired the Aspen down payment. The week we brought her home for hospice, they signed off on the Porsche. This, I said, is the legacy you were trying to protect. The board voted unanimously. Ryan terminated. Brenda barred from every property. Kenji authorized to pursue full civil and criminal prosecution. Security walked them out. Ryan begged. Brenda walked out with her head high, a queen in a fantasy of her own making. Alone afterward, I understood something. Every step I'd taken hadn't been mine alone. The audit, the timeline, the evidence, I'd been following a map Carol drew before she died. She knew grief would blind me. She knew my love for Ryan was the weakness Brenda would exploit. So in her final months, while her body failed, her mind built the case that would win the war she knew was coming. A week later, Kenji arranged one final meeting to discuss separation terms. Brenda arrived thinking she still held a card to play, that I'd want to avoid a public trial. She and Ryan sat down across from us, diminished, desperate. "What's it going to take to make this go away?" she demanded. "There is no offer," Kenji said. "This isn't about the money. That's a matter for the district attorney. This is about the will." He opened a new folder. Carol's will, signed 2 months before she died, revoked all previous versions. Article 3 left me her liquid assets, nothing surprising there. Brenda relaxed. Then Kenji reached Article 4. Carol's controlling 51%, her separate property under our prenup, would pass into a new entity, the Peterson Legacy Trust, bound by what she called the bloodline clause. The shares could only transfer to an heir who could provide definitive biological proof of being her direct descendant. Brenda laughed it off, just a fancy way of saying it goes to Ryan, their only son. She demanded a blood test, certain of the outcome. Kenji broke the seal on a manila envelope. 3 months earlier, Carol had insisted Ryan get a full executive physical, worried, she'd said, about his cholesterol. She'd quietly ordered a comparative genetic panel run against her own sample. The report, 0 common genetic markers, probability of maternity 0%. Ryan wasn't her biological son, he never had been. Brenda's calculations shattered in real time. If not Ryan, then who? The door opened. A woman in scrubs and a lab coat stepped in. Doctor Ann Wallace, a cardiothoracic surgeon from Philadelphia, with Carol's exact eyes. Kenji introduced her as Carol's biological daughter, given up for adoption at 19, long before she ever met me, and now the sole verified heir to the Peterson Legacy Trust. Brenda's mind simply broke. She accused us of fraud, of hiring an actress, until Kenji explained that Carol and Ann had reconnected 6 months earlier and coordinated the entire transition together. DNA already certified and appended to the will. There was nothing left to fight. Ryan didn't even react to Ann's entrance. He just rocked in his chair, whispering that his mother wasn't his mother, that none of it had been real. 40 years of identity, gone in an instant. Justice ground forward slowly but completely. The civil suit was filed before Brenda and Ryan cleared the parking garage. Criminal charges followed: grand larceny, wire fraud, conspiracy. With her accounts frozen, Brenda turned on Ryan instantly, filing for divorce, claiming she'd been coerced by a weak husband. She walked away with nothing but legal bills, the Aspen house and Porsche seized to help cover the theft. Ryan pleaded guilty to everything. He'd lost his mother, his wife, and his identity in a matter of weeks. There was nothing left to lie for. He avoided prison, given his cooperation and a quiet word from me to the DA, but was sentenced to 5 years probation, community service, and a restitution plan he'd be paying off for the rest of his life. At 40, he took a job at a logistics warehouse, learning for the first time what real work felt like. Months later, spring had thawed the Chicago winter. I walked the depot grounds beside Ann, in town for her first board meeting as chairwoman. We were still strangers, bound by the ghost of a woman we'd both loved in very different ways. "She would have been so proud of you," I told her, "saving lives." Ann smiled, Carol's smile exactly. "She told me she was proud of you too. She said you were the only man she ever met who built an empire and kept his soul. She had no interest in running the company herself. Her calling was in Philadelphia. She'd stay on as chairwoman, protecting her mother's legacy from a distance, while the board hired a professional CEO. She planned all of this," I said. She saved her company. I think she saved me too. She saved all of us, Jake, Anne said, looking up at the Peterson freight sign. She gave us the chance to build something new. Something based on truth. The grief never fully leaves. But for the first time in a long time, it wasn't the only thing I felt. I felt peace. I felt hope. Carol's legacy wasn't just steel and concrete. It was standing right beside me. And it was only just beginning. A legacy built on deceit collapses. A legacy built on truth endures. Carol's greatest strength wasn't only her forgiveness 40 years ago. It was her clear-eyed refusal to let a lie outlive her. Greed and betrayal always have their moment. But they never survive the facts.